Good morning. My name is Hang Ho, and I'm responsible for the JP Morgan Chase Foundation work in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Latin America. And I'm very glad to welcome all of you here this morning to such an esteemed audience to the JP Morgan Great Hall. I hope that you will all agree with me that we have ended up in a rather unique and apt venue for today's event. The Great Hall of the old City of London School for Boys. So we're surrounded by a history of educators and high achievers, and I'm sure a great many success, which serves as a good reminder that education and skills have always served as a foundation for our economies, holding up our enterprises, our households, and our communities. There is another fortuitous reason why I'm especially delighted to be hosting today's launch, as it's a result of a partnership between two organizations that we, JP Morgan, have held in great esteem and are collaborating with on two very distinct but two very complementary initiatives. Our partnership with both the OECD, working on an occupational skills mismatch indicators, as well as with EPI, working on a cost-benefit analysis of the dual apprenticeship system from a firm's perspective, it's part of JP Morgan's broader commitment to creating and enabling more economic opportunities and also enabling greater access to them for all. We do this because we believe that the success of our firm is intrinsically linked to the success of our communities, and that we have a significant responsibility and also a vital contribution to make. And when we look at the complex economic, social, technological challenges that we're all facing today, we have to acknowledge the reality that despite the tremendous progress that has been achieved over the past 50 years globally, there are parts of the society that are not benefiting from this progress. Too many people are being shut out of the rewards of a growing economy, and the frustration and disillusionment that this has resulted have deep and far-reaching impact. We see it unfolding across Europe, just as we did in the Middle East a few years back. We see that in the growing indicators of inequality and lack of social mobility. So during the past 5 years, JP Morgan Chase have embarked on a few significant initiatives, long-term initiatives, focusing on this imperative of promoting economic inclusion and economic mobility. And while we deployed approximately around 250 million last year to do this, we know that money alone will not solve the problem. I'm sure you'll agree with me that we've all seen too often well-meaning, well-intentioned money, publicly and privately, fail to result in long-term impact. So a critical part of our strategy is try to understand the underlying problems and looking in within to try to figure out what are the underlying issues. And we do this through data analysis and measurement in terms of what works and what doesn't work, in order to better apply the right type of capabilities needed in order to make and create sustainable change. And this is why partnership with organizations like the OECD and EPI are really critical to our approach, which is informed by data and evidence of what is the most effective at driving inclusive growth. Our focus and our efforts are really centered around 3 pillars of opportunity. How do you create more jobs through working with small businesses? How do you promote financial health? And how do you develop the workforce? How do you equip people with the skills that they need in order to compete and thrive in today's economy as well as the future? And through the evidence of our work, we see that educational attainment is absolutely critical, no question about that, and I'm sure you will agree. But it is not sufficient any longer as the only attainment in order to ensure a smooth transition into the labour market, nor guarantee a pathway to quality employment. And also, significant gender and socioeconomic disparities still exist in both educational outcomes, but also progression into well-paid, well-recognized career pathways and professionals. And we all know that on balance, though I'm sure that there are statistics to further illustrate this, that modern economies are set to require more skilled and high-skilled professionals with a skill set that's matched to the labour market requirement. Yet we see too many people, particularly a disproportionate number of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, that are leaving the education system with insufficient qualifications, credentials, and skills to obtain a foothold in the labour market, never mind progress or remain in it. This is why, in addition to our commitment to addressing the skills mismatch for workers and employers through new skills at work, we've recently committed another additional 75 million through new skills for youth, with the goal of supporting institutions to prepare young people for jobs and careers by improving the access to demand-led skills training and career pathways. Because like PISA, we believe that in addition to pure knowledge acquisition, it's much more interesting to see how this knowledge can be applied and then transformed into employability and occupational skills as well, making it work. But similar to the observation around educational attainment, we recognize that skills training alone will not suffice, and we know that through our experience as both a foundation and an employer, other social, cultural, and economic capitals matter as well. And to compete effectively with their peers, particularly peers from more advantaged backgrounds, young people need early, practical exposure to the world of work and quality guidance from their social networks, informally and formally. They need to be able to imagine themselves in a job which may at first glance seem alien and beyond their skills and experience. They need contacts, professional network, to help them make the imaginative leap. Yet evidence has shown time and again that if you're from a particular background or particular demography, you won't have this access to the same educational opportunities, the culture circles, or the professional networks, and you definitely won't be able to make as informed choice or informed choices about your future careers and pathways. We know that this is a territory that is most fragmented. It's difficult to replicate. It's even more difficult to scale. But we also know that this is the area where JP Morgan can be most effective, the crossroad where education meets employment, where we're able to deploy our broadest asset, both as a foundation as well as an employer, to create the deepest impact. Or so we hope, and that's what we're working towards. And we're under no illusion that this is a complex and multifaceted challenge, with a long tail starting very early on in early childhood. And so moving the dial will need many actors across many sectors, driving and pushing and pulling many different levers along this long journey of a young person's life. And so we're glad to be able to play our part and make the contribution that we're able to make through the partnerships such as those with the OECD and EPI. So welcome to everybody this morning, and we really look forward to hearing the result. Thank you.
Thank you, Hang, for that introduction, and thank you so much to you and colleagues at the JP Morgan Foundation for hosting us this morning in these lovely surroundings. I'm Natalie Pereira, the Executive Director and Head of Research at the Education Policy Institute. And last December, we were really delighted at the EPI to be able to host a global launch of the PISA 2015 findings on excellence and equity in education amongst OECD nations. And it's a real privilege for us once again to be able to work with colleagues in the OECD and with the JP Morgan Foundation to co-host today's findings on student well-being. Now, the PISA rankings and the wealth of information that sit beneath those rankings are increasingly becoming the go-to place for international performance and comparisons in education. And so we're very pleased to be able also to play our part. Because as we'll hear this morning, schools aren't just a place where children learn reading, writing and maths. It's increasingly where they form relationships, where they build resilience, where they work in teams, and where they make really important choices about their future and their lives. And so it's crucial that we understand the importance of the role that the education system can play in supporting all dimensions of a child's development. And it's also crucial that we understand how those wider non-cognitive dimensions can then have an impact and improvement on attainment. So before I hand over to Gabriela Ramos, who will present the key findings from today's report, I also must remind you, particularly those of our media colleagues today, that the report is still under a strict embargo until 10 a.m. UK time, so please do not tweet or publish any findings before then. So then, following Gabriela's presentation, we will then hear from Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who is the Chief Executive of Save the Children International. And there will then be some time for questions to both Gabriela and Helle. And then we'll take a short coffee break, and then please do come back because we have a very esteemed panel who will take questions from all of you after the coffee break. Thank you.
Well, that was a beautiful start. I just stand up and the thing fell, so. But good morning, and thank you for hosting us, Ho. Thank you for the introduction, Natalie, and great to share the event with Helle. We all admire for her work with children. And you know, when we wanted to present this report, because as Natalie mentioned, we launched the PISA results on science in 2015, December, here. We almost feel like we call the usual suspects, no? Every time we want to release very interesting material, every time we want to share with you the issues that we learn at the OECD, we are finding ourselves with the very same usual suspects. So thank you for joining us again. And I think that both presentations by Hope and by Natalie are putting this presentation in the right context. Because we are not in a vacuum. This presentation just confirms what we have been documenting in other fields of work of the OECD, which is the global economy, which is the backlash against globalization, which is the backlash of an economic model that probably has been unidimensional, focusing on material well-being, which has been really delivering not very good outcomes in terms of inclusiveness. And we know that. We know that because that is being expressed in the voting and in the democratic processes. And where would we be if it's the UK who decided again to go against that very same model? So in the PISA work, and I'm joined with Mario Piacentini, who will be in the panel, and by my colleagues in the OECD. In the PISA, of course, people might be saying, well, you're focusing too much on cognitive skills. You're focusing too much on academic achievement. You're focusing too much on those issues that are important, we know, for performance in life and to have a fulfilling life. But there are so many other things that matter for people. And this is also what we're trying to do to build a new narrative for growth and to have a more multidimensional living standard and more inclusive, which is what matters to really give results for all the people. And this is what we are exactly doing with this very thin book. and if you visit the webpage, you will find a massive amount of data, which is what matters, because you can enjoy just scrolling into the data. And this is for very busy people if you would really want to get it very, very fast. So let me just move into the results and to the evidence. And then, of course, I will be very happy to listen to Helle and to respond to your questions in terms of what do we do about it, because this is something that we always find. We inundate you with massive amount of data and information, and then you tell us, and what do I do about it? And that's the most important part of the whole thing. So let me tell you what is this. This volume of results from PISA 2015 focus on how education systems can promote not only cognitive capacity, but also the psychological, social, and physical capabilities that students need to live a happy life today and be equipped with 21st century skills. And you know, when you get all this information and the conclusion is that when you are happy, you learn better, it's almost like common sense, no? It's like grandma talking. Well, that's exactly the case. Because, yeah, if you feel good, you learn better. And so how do we get into all these elements? Here are the issues that, but I cannot see there is this. Yeah. So it's cognitive, that of course matter, but then psychological, social, and physical well-being. Now, what the data tell us? Here you have it. The good news is that PISA data shows the majority of 15-year-old students are happy. They report being happy. Remember, this is a questionnaire that we put to the 75 countries that of the students that presented PISA tests. So we then ask these questions, and they report on that they are happy with a life satisfaction of 7.23 on a scale from 0 to 10. Now remember also that these are the kids that are in school. There are many that are not in school, and therefore this is also probably capturing those that are already, let's say, privileged, because they are still in school at age 15. But still, about 12% of students are not satisfied with their lives. In some countries, it's over 20%. This is not about grades. There is little difference in reported life satisfaction between top achieving and low achieving students. And then there is an additional element, because Helle and I were also in Rome last week talking about gender. I have to say that there is a very worrisome results regarding gender in this report. Again, we confirm, and this is evidence, that girls report lower levels of satisfaction, that they are subject to a lot of pressures from the social media, that they are less happy with themselves. And so this is something that we also need to tackle from the gender perspective, and also for the self-confidence of girls that we know, and we have measured also, that is lower than boys. On average, across OECD countries, you have it here, boys and girls, around 29% of girls, but 39% of boys reported that they are very satisfied with their lives. This is a 10 percentage point difference, and I think, Mario will confirm, I think that in the UK is worst. I think that the girls in the UK even report higher, and actually we had a very interesting health ministerial that was chaired by the UK Minister of Health, and from the health perspective, they're very concerned about the psychological disorders that girls are reporting, and the more problems that we get in the health system for all these girls that arrive to hospitals because they feel bad, or they really are under a lot of stress. So this is a very important point. Now, disadvantaged students report themselves around 0.4 point lower than advantaged schools on the 10-point scale satisfaction, and this is just normal. Low-income groups, of course, have more levels of stress. Self-evaluation in comparison to more advantaged students and obstacles to achieving material education, health, and leisure goals are likely to be behind the difference between high-income and low-income students. But the lower life satisfaction reported by 15-year-old girls in PISA is probably a reflection of girls' self-criticism, but also the society, also the role models that we promote, the stereotyping that we promote, the kind of lower level of ambition for girls in school and in the houses. And let me tell you, we also found that girls sometimes are graded lower in a trend by teachers, which is also unacceptable. PISA 2015 does not collect data on a student's body image, but the results on eating habits revealed that girls were much more likely than boys to skip breakfast or more likely to skip dinner. And in the UK is higher. The percentage point difference between girls and boys skipping breakfast was particularly high at 14 percentage point, almost double the OECD average. This is for the UK. The average in the OECD is 8 points. Now, research, of course, suggests that exposure to image of overly thin girls and women in traditional media, on social media, have negative impact on girls' satisfaction about themselves. And this is the 15-year-old, so it's a very, very sensitive time in the life of girls. And this causes this complex and multifaceted problem. But of course, the role of media in promoting gender stereotypes seems to be undermining girls' well-being, and we're starting to look at these issues because it's very important. You can do a lot of policies in all the fields, and if you continue reproducing this stereotype and in massive media, it's just not going to work. Now, what other elements count on the student well-being? We measure anxiety. Anxiety about schoolwork is one of the sources of stress more often cited by all school-age children and adolescents, and in fact is strongly correlated to life satisfaction. And of course, we all can have anxiety, of course, because you need to perform, because you have pressure, because you have to deliver, but when it reaches level that impaired or kind of put a brake on your own learning processes, then it becomes a problem. Here is the table on anxiety. On average, across OECD countries, students who reported the highest level of anxiety also reported a low level of life satisfaction in 1.2 points below lower than students who reported the lowest level of anxiety regarding text. And what can I tell you? I think the UK is one of the champions in terms of putting a lot of pressure for tests, delivering on tests, and this really increases the anxiety for kids. This is more pronounced 2 points lower. Schoolwork-related anxiety is complex and variable, but common sources of anxiety are high competitive learning environment and long study hours. And for example, in Belgium and Israel, students in schools with long study times are at least 11 percentage points more likely to report that they feel anxious for a test, even if they are well prepared, than students in school with short study time. And this is very interesting because anxiety is not related to performance. You would imagine that kids that do well will be less anxious, but it's not true. Even if they are well prepared or if they are top performers, they can also report very high levels of anxiety depending on how the system operates. The key is to reduce anxiety while promoting motivation, and across all countries and economies that participated in PISA 2015, the students with greater overall motivation to achieve reported higher satisfaction with life. And we need to get rid of this idea that you put pressure, they need to compete and they need to be the top and they need to be resilient. And the fact is that there are so many ways to achieve good outcomes without putting people in so much stress. And we learn from each other because one of the points of PISA is, of course, to show the more the systems that do better. And I want to show you 3 cases. The red ones, Finland, Netherlands, and Switzerland, because these are 2 top performer countries and performers who actually demonstrated that they have lower levels of anxiety and systems that are more, report higher levels of well-being. Not only the students in these countries do relatively high on the average in science on PISA, but also report higher levels of satisfaction. And here, it's the students in these countries are less likely than their peers to report feeling anxious for tests, and you will see it here. Look where they are. It's amazing. And they are top performers. So we almost want to bottle their knowledge and sell it, and then we would not have any budgetary problem. But the fact is that it's amazing that these kids do not report the same level of anxiety. Across OECD countries, 56% of students that report that they feel anxious for at least for a test, even if they are well prepared. This was 49 in Finland, so 7 points below, 39 in the Netherlands, and only 34 in Switzerland. Are there any Swiss in the audience? Well, okay, so they will not share it, but we will ask Mario. On average, 37% of students reported they feel very tense when they study, but only 21% of students in Switzerland, 18% of students in Finland, and only 14% of students, compared to 37% average. Only 14% of students in Finland and in the Netherlands reported that they feel very tense when they study. So and this, of course, is related on how the school and the teachers manage their classes and how do they develop support system for students. And here again, you see students who want to be one of the best in their class. Not wrong to want to be competitive or one of the best of their class, but the fact is that how do we encourage the students to be self-motivated and high achievers without really just getting into this very strong competitive move. So the key therefore is to foster motivation without excessive external pressure to be the best or fear of failure. How do we teach our kids to deal with failure? This is a very important element without destroying the self-esteem, because this really causes anxiety. In this slide, you'll see that students, again, in the Netherlands, Finland, and Switzerland, feel much less the pressure to be the best in their class. Given they still achieve high scores in PISA, their motivation to perform seems to be more positive, more intrinsic, and more confident. And to increase well-being and raise performance, teachers and parents need to find ways to encourage students' motivation to learn and achieve without generating an excessive fear of failure. And, of course, teachers have a very important role to play. I think this is, every time we present any report on PISA, is about teachers, and, of course, it's about parents and it's about students. PISA tells us that schools where students are happy, where they report a higher life satisfaction than the country average, is also schools in which students report higher levels of learning support from their teachers. After accounting for students' performance, gender, and socioeconomic status, students who reported that their science teachers adapt their lessons to the class needs and knowledge were less likely to report feeling anxious even if they are well prepared for a test, or to report that they get very tense when they study. And this is important because teenagers are looking for strong social ties, acceptance, care, and support from others. When students feel supported by the teachers and that they are part of a caring school community, they are more likely to perform better academically and be more motivated in schools. And it doesn't matter if the school is rich or poor or with lots of equipment or not. It's about the teacher and how much the teacher care about the students and support them. On the other hand, negative student-teacher relationships are strongly linked to a low sense of belonging and psychological distress. On average, across the OECD, students who reported that their teacher grades them harder than other students are 40% more likely to get very tense for a student. You have it here in the graph, 44%. And the students who feel their teacher does not think they are as smart as they really are 60% more likely to get very tense when a student. And this is also related to gender, because parents, and this is also documented, parents and school teachers have lower expectations for girls. And this then becomes self-fulfilling, because if you are not expected to be a high achiever, why would you even do the effort? Another worry association is that in most countries, schools where students felt offended or treated unfairly by the teacher are also schools with a higher frequency of bullying. And bullying is a real problem. And I think this is one of the main messages of this report. If we were to achieve something with this analysis, would be to focus on eliminating bullying, because it has devastated effect in kids, it has devastated effect in school, and it has devastated effects in our societies. And this is happening in our watch. Is there, and we are just looking at how this affects all of these kids. Negative student-teacher relationships are strongly linked to a low sense of belonging and psychological distress. And on average across the OECD, students who reported that the teacher, this you saw it, this suggests that teachers are important role models in fair behavior and respect and should be trained in basic methods of observation, listening, and intercultural communication to help better their students. And unfortunately, PISA 2015 data shows an alarming large proportion of students that are reported to be bullying in the school. Around 11% of students reported that they are this is the kind of bullying that I want to report to you. 11% of students reported that they are frequently made fun of. 7% reported that they are frequently left out of things, and 8% reported that they are frequently the object of nasty rumors in school. Around 4% of students, roughly one per class, reported that they are hit or pushed at least a few times per month. And here in the UK, bullying in all its form is above OECD average. While there is no one-size-fits-all approach for preventing bullying, effective anti-bullying programs involve a whole-of-school approach with coordinated engagement among teachers and students and parents. And again, we can learn from some practices in other countries. For example, in the Castilla y León in Spain, only 1.7% of students reported feeling threatened by other students compared to the OECD average of 3.7%. The region anti-bullying plan incorporates measures like supporting victims, re-educating offenders, updating bullying protocol, and coordinating actions to help fight against bullying. Other countries can learn from these best practices and ensure that we address this very damaging problem. But well-being is dynamic and fragile balance to be achieved, and it is undermined in one part of our lives. This can also spill over in other parts of the world. So not only what happens inside the school, but also what happens outside the school is important for well-being of children. Parents, family, and carers have a critical role to play, and this is a message that PISA has also sent everywhere around the world. Parents need to care, and parents need to get engaged. It's not just leaving the kids in the school. And let me tell you, that just by children, all these things were asked to parents. And the last line, spend time just talking to my child. It's just amazing in terms of the impact it can have in the life satisfaction as reported by children. You don't even need to be a high achiever parent and helping kids with all of the material things for them to increase. Just sit with them and talk to them. And this is just proven there because it's even higher than attending school meetings or discussing how are they doing in school. It's just talking to them what becomes very, very important. And of course, other activities outside home are also important. Physical activities. This is also common sense, but as they say, healthy mind in healthy body. On average, across OECD countries, students who reported taking part in some moderate or vigorous physical activity are 2.9 percentage points less likely to feel very anxious about tests, 7.7 percentage points less likely to feel like an outsider at school, and however, on average, in OECD countries, about 5.7 of boys and 7.5 of girls reported that they do not participate in any form of physical activity outside school, with disadvantaged students being most affected. And while many don't do any exercise, students are spending a lot of time watching television, playing video games, and increasingly going online. And this is, again, becoming a real problem because having access to internet is good and having access to all these tools are very important, but they are abused in many ways. Here, between 2012 and 2015, the time spent online outside school increased by 40 minutes per day on both weekends and weekdays. Across OECD countries, 90% of students enjoy using digital devices, but PISA 2015 results show that in most participating countries and economies, extreme internet use, more than 6 hours per day, has a negative relationship with students' life satisfaction and performance. And I have to say that the UK is also a champion in terms of the use, increased use and accumulated hours per day in terms of internet and social networks. And this is also a source of pressure for kids and cyberbullying, which is another feature. After accounting for a student's socioeconomic status, extreme internet users score around 30 points lower in all subject PISA assesses than students who use the internet less. Now, what are the implications for policy? As I mentioned to you, what do we do about all this? And of course, it will depend on the country where you are. It depends on how you structure the school. It depends on the social preferences. But the reality is that we also have some interesting results to share with you. First, countries can design interventions to promote psychological health, motivation, and confidence at school. And this is very important. I think the way we frame the fact that cognitive skills is what matter is wrong, is completely wrong. Because the learning process is much more complex and includes all of the skills that human beings have. Social, emotional, tolerance, empathy, self-resilience, self-confidence, all these things are important. And actually, these other skills that we have been neglecting for life help the cognitive skills, because kids that are motivated, that feel good, are of course much more prone to be learning fast. And there are very interesting examples. For example, Korea, which is one of the countries that reported worst on well-being, they are trying to innovate. They are developing free semester for kids not to be subject to academic or to have more extracurricular activities. In the UK, the pre-service health education program includes applied health and well-being elements and teacher training. Finland's School on the Moves is a national action strategy that takes a student into their local environment to work with the community, fostering caring school environment, for example, with peer and teacher-student relationship. The Cimale Emozione in Switzerland is focusing to how to help kids to deal with their emotions. And it's also, of course, important to design education policies that promote positive synergies between the school and the home environments. Australia, a student well-being hub involves the whole community, the house, and teaching kids healthy habits. And here is the list of policy implications. The whole point is, how do we support kids? How do we give a personalized support? How do we help teachers to focus on the needs of a specific kids and to make the intervention so targeted and so well oriented into the needs of kids, and to build up this more comprehensive agenda that probably will deliver better societies than what we have been able to achieve. And this is a beautiful quote that Alice put in my speech. The great English novelist Graham Greene once said that there is always a moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in. This is beautiful. I think that this is what we are all aiming to prepare kids to be ready when that door opens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela, for that incredibly insightful overview of the findings from today's report. And there's lots of other detailed messages that come out from the report today. So please do take the time to go through the findings too. And we will cover, we'll have some time for Q&A both with Gabriela and with our expert panel later on. But right now I'd like to introduce you to Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who is the Chief Executive of Save the Children International.
To be here. I have been a fan of PISA for many years. I have also found myself in a position when I was Prime Minister in Denmark to be extremely annoyed with the results that came out of PISA. But I always believed that the whole thinking about the PISA is amazing. Because basically what we are saying to ourselves is that we want to learn from the best. We want to learn from our neighbors. We want to learn from the people who are actually proved to be the best performers in a certain area. And also what Gabriela was saying, that this is data. We are insisting on a data revolution so that we can really not argue with what comes out. So I think that's an amazing thing, and I always felt that it was the right thing for developed countries to really look at their neighbors to find out who is performing well. But I also find the PISA, what PISA does is very, very close to our hearts in Save the Children. Because in Save the Children, we believe that children should have a voice. Children need a voice, and what this survey does is actually to give children a strong voice. It looks closely at what children are, how they're doing, how they're feeling, and it delivers with their voice a very clear message to policymakers. That is very, very powerful. We just heard from Gabriela, and I think what this report does is that it takes the discussion and children's voice even further, because it asks children not only about their performance, but it asks children about almost every part of their life that affects their performance in school. And it shows very, very clearly that to do well in school, it is not, as Gabriela says, only cognitive skills. It is a cocktail of all the things that influence a child's life. And to go to the question, how much time are you actually talking to your parents, even though it is so evident, so self-evident that that is important for a child, it is so important to get the data on these issues. So I thank you very, very much for doing it. It is a very powerful document that you have presented us with today. Thank you so much for that. And I also feel this is something that I can be using in my world. And I think that's why I've been invited today, because I was discussing myself, why have I actually been invited to talk today? But I think it's also because the results that you're presenting is something that we can use in the developing world and in humanitarian settings as well, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Because, as I said, it is dear to Save the Children to have children's voice being a change agent for politicians. But it is also dear to my heart as CEO of Save the Children. And what we're doing is basically we work for children in more than 120 countries across the world. One of our main issues is, of course, that all children in this world benefit from a quality education. Get access to education, but not only that they benefit from a quality education. And I believe that education is perhaps the most empowering force in the world, for the individual child, but also for our global community. Because what education does is that it creates knowledge, it builds confidence, it breaks down the barriers for each individual child, and it creates opportunity. It is so powerful. And for children, of course, it is always part of their pathway to create a better life for themselves and their families. So education also have a very strong tendency to work for the next generation. However, right now, as we talk to each other this morning, around the world, hundreds of millions of children are still missing out of that opportunity. You all have heard about Malala. She just became the youngest ever UN messenger of peace. And she described this heart-wrenching situation best when she said to the world, in some parts of the world, Students are going to school every day. It's their normal life. But in other parts of the world, we are starving for education. It's like a precious gift. It's like a diamond. Those are very powerful words. And all of us in this room believe that all children deserve that precious gift. That precious gift of education that can change their lives. And in fact, this is not only something that we believe in, it is also something that we pledged to this world's children that we would give to them. When we all decided on the Sustainable Development Goals, we gave a commitment to this world's children that we would give inclusive, quality education to all children. And we also promised that we would do that by 2030. However, we can see now that if we continue at the current pace, we are going to miss this deadline by about 50 years. We're not going to deliver by 2030, we are going to miss it by 50 years. And that is up to 3 more generations of children being let down. My message is simple: we can't let this happen. And we have to work very hard now to make things go in a different direction. And we have to invest in the most disadvantaged children first. That could be the Syrian children taking refuge in Jordan. It could be children from deprived communities in the wealthiest of the OECD countries. And I think actually this point comes across clearly in the report on the latest PISA result, where it is stated, and I quote, "Learning should not be hindered by whether a child comes from a poor family, has an immigrant background, is raised by a single parent, or has limited resources at home. Successful education understands this." So our goal is clear. Successful education systems find ways to reach children that are, for many reasons, left behind. And the next question, of course, is how do we achieve that? There's no magic bullet, unfortunately. However, I want to suggest 4 things that we could do to at least get us back on track. First, we have to face up to the fact that education in emergency humanitarian situations really matter. What we know is that the global refugee crisis is as bad as it has been since the Second World War. We have 65 million people displaced worldwide. Half of these people are children. That is almost always the case, that half of any group that is affected by war and conflict are children. And we also know that the average time that a person cannot go back to their homes, actually are refugees or on the move, is now has to be counted in double digits. Not in days, not in months, but in years. And of course, the humanitarian needs of refugee children and their families go well beyond food and shelter and health interventions. No, we need to understand that if so many people are in a humanitarian situation, education also has to be part of our humanitarian answer. We're not living up to this at the moment. Out of all global humanitarian funding, only 2% actually goes to support education. And with the number of refugee children out of school approaching about 4 million children, this is, of course, nowhere near enough. But I think it is fair to say, I know this is a very commonly used term, that if we don't invest in education for all these refugee children or children on the move, we will lose another generation. The second thing we need to be doing, and that's both the international community and national governments, is that we have to prioritize education funding. And the scale of this challenge is actually enormous. To get the 260 million children currently out of school back into school, and to make the 130 million children currently only reaching grade 4 without learning anything. I mean, that's the other tragic that we have in this world, that we send a lot of children into school, but 130 million children do not learn anything when they are in school. So the solution to this enormous problem, of course, have to be quite big. That means that governments need to grow their tax base to fund education. Ideally, they should spend up to 6% of their GDP on education. Far too many countries are not doing that now. And of course, international donors should not back away from this challenge. They also have to be part of this solution. The education share of our own overseas development budgets should increase over the next years. But if we do all this, we will still by 2030 be 25 billion short of what needs to be met to meet our global education goal. And that is why I am a member of this Education Commission chaired by Gordon Brown. We have suggested that we, on the international arena, create a new financing tool that could actually build up financing for education, because I think it goes without saying we will not be able to do this unless we have much more a new financing tool for education. The third thing we need to do to get closer to our goals is that governments simply have to learn more from each other. Learning from the best, just like is the whole raison d'etre for the PISA work. And that's what we are trying to do also in this Education Commission that I just talked about. We are a group of government, civil society, business leaders who are working to get all countries in the world to improve their education system. And our goal is for the performance of all countries to rise to the level of the progress being made by the top 25% of education improvers today. So we are actually trying to say the PISA way of thinking, that is what we want to use for the whole world, and really push the low performers to look at what the 25% best performers in education are doing, and doing it across the piece, not only OECD, but globally. I think that could make a huge difference, because it actually matters for an African country like Ghana or something like that to show what they're doing, to show that they're doing well, so other countries can learn from that. And the fourth thing we have to do, and I must agree with Gabriela on that as well, I think we go to the same conferences far too much, but we have to prioritize girls. We have in this world almost 480 million women around the world who are illiterate. 2/3 of the global population of illiterate adults are actually women. So it is very clear that we must stop excluding girls from education. How do we do that? Well, of course, this, as so many other issues, are extremely complex. But one place to start is to make sure that girls are not becoming brides. Girls should not marry, but we know that one girl under 15 is married every 7 seconds. Girls under 15 should be focused on starting a new year in school, not starting a new life of disadvantage as mothers. We must stop girls being married off. We must make sure that we create a world where this is not the norm, and where girls are sent to school, not into marriage. And this is actually also something that could have enormous economic impact on our world. Because if we close the gender gap in education by 2030, and of course education is an enormous part of that, we are looking at benefits to the global economy of about $25 trillion. It's a staggering amount, and even if it's not close to that 25 trillion, it's a big amount. So I think it actually underlines that upfront investment it does seem quite small to what we can gain from educating girls worldwide. And these are suggestions to what we can be doing now. And one of the big discussions that I feel we have in education these years is that we are not separating the OECD countries and the developing countries and humanitarian settings. One of the discussions we have to have in the coming years is to learn from all countries, to bring these figures together. So when I started out saying that I wasn't sure why I got invited, I worked out that that is why. I worked out that in order for the least developed countries to improve, in order for us to keep focusing on education in humanitarian settings, we need to all learn from each other. And the findings that you have of this report will go directly into the mindset of how we work in developing countries. So thank you for doing this. I believe it is when we share the data, create this data revolution, put all the factors together, that we can make real progress. So let's do that together. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for that incredibly empowering, thoughtful couple of sessions. Now, how I suggest we do this is we have a panel session after the coffee break with the OECD report author, Mario, and with 3 other UK experts, both in practice and academia. So what I suggest is, if you have any detailed questions on the OECD report, or indeed the policy implications for the UK specifically, you might want to wait to ask Mario and colleagues later on this morning. What you might like to ask both Gabriela and Helle about now is about the global implications and what nations can do in response to some of the findings we've been talking about this morning. So
we can also talk about the UK.
Sure, great.
Fine. Don't worry.
So I'll take questions. If you could tell us your name and your organisation, that would be great. So just at the front, yeah.
Our Education Partnerships Group. I have a question about the presentation that Gabriela made earlier on the differences in well-being across countries, which was mostly highlighted by the report, and in most OECD findings, it is often comparison across countries that is the most interesting finding for the media and for a lot of users of the information. But it seems like that there were significant differences within countries in terms of how young people differ in their well-being, their levels of anxiety, and all the other factors that you presented earlier. So the question is the biggest challenge within countries, that countries have solutions already that are under implementation, under execution to address these challenges, or is it that really there are some countries, because of their systems, because of cultural factors, because of historical factors, that you have these very marked differences in children's or young people's well-being? Thank you.
Okay, no, well, I think you answered the question because you said, is it how they organize their systems? Is it how they impact the school performance with outside forces and the parents and the society in which they locate? Well, this is what really explains the within-country performance. Because the reality is that you have, even in the countries that on average perform well, you would always see that there are very clear differences in certain regions. Regional divides are very high in all of the OECD countries. You will have differences between neighborhoods. We should not forget that the socioeconomic situation of kids also are a very strong determinant of their well-being in general. And then you reproduce this notion that better off schools, and this is something that Helle mentioned, better off schools will always provide better quality teaching that focus not only on academic achievement, but also in trying to develop all the other skills that will provide the kids with self-confidence and more elements to fulfill their full potential. But this is located also in the same school systems. So you can learn from your own country in which areas you are performing better and which schools are performing better in these domains. And the beauty of all the data that we have is that there is not one single country that can say that they get everything perfect. We have the examples of the Netherlands, of Switzerland, and of Finland, because in general they do better, but the reality is that, of course, they have also their own problems, and they have been able to address probably the impact of what I mentioned, the lack of engagement of parents, or the impact of internet use, or the way you organize the school practices that provide negative pressure or teaching lack of engagement with kids that comes with not so positive outcomes. The whole question goes down again on how do you help teachers to acknowledge this role that they play, and how do you help them to deal with a much more difficult agenda to manage. It's much easier to say, okay, let's focus on math and science and learning, and I just prepare a test and I just put the pressure on kids, than saying that let's look at the overall development of a human being and let's see what differentiated needs each student have. And for that, of course, you need a lot of support system in the schools. You need to look at how to reduce the administrative burden of teachers. You need to see how do you develop the support systems to help the kids that are at more disadvantage. You need to see how do you tailor-make the interventions and provide the teachers with the capacity to recognize the very differentiated needs of each student and try to provide with each student with what they need to learn. So it's in reality how you develop or how you organize the school systems, and how do you provide the teachers with the support and the training they need to fulfill this more complex agenda.
Thank you. And the lady at the front here. We've got a mic coming, if that's okay.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Jenny Anderson. I write for Quartz. I think those of us who have covered PISA for a long time have definitely been very anxious to see this report to kind of balance it against this idea of, is there a cost to the very high performance, the very, very high achieving countries? Singapore did incredibly well, obviously, in 2015 PISA across the board in all three categories. I was surprised to see the conclusion that the performance between high academic achievement, or I'm trying to just make sure I get this right, between performance and happiness to be weak. And yet I do know that at least many of the countries I cover in Singapore and in Shanghai, there are a lot of efforts underway to try to take pressure off of kids, because there are very high anxiety levels, high suicide rates in Korea. You highlighted one of the efforts. So I wanted you to just expand on that weak link and just, I guess I want more assurance in how we come to that conclusion. There were high anxiety levels in some of the high achieving countries, but again, there seems to be this weak overall performance. So if you wouldn't mind just maybe elaborating a little bit on how you got there, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
I would rephrase the way you put it, because the reality is that what the report tells us is high levels of achievement produce high level of satisfaction and happiness, let's say. So low achievement, failure, produces a lot of stress and a lot of unhappiness. So the question is not whether you promote high achievement or not. We all need to promote high achievement, but how do you do that? Taking into account, as I said, the other set of skills that we need to be developing for kids to deliver. And look at what I mentioned in the presentation before, which was amazing. Look at how the students in the high achiever systems, like Switzerland, define themselves as high achievers. They don't say, I want to be the best and beat everybody, and I want to be obtaining the best grades ever all the time. What they say is that they really want to succeed and achieve themselves their full potential, not in comparison with the rest. This question of ranking students and single students in terms of you are 1, 2, 3, you are number 34, thank you, and you are number 3, is stigmatizing, and it doesn't help. And so, and you might have some very highly competitive systems like Asian and Korean, but we know that the pressure is so high. But because it's putting a lot of emphasis on the competitive side of the system, which is not what we need to focus. What we need to focus is how children feel that they are fulfilling their full potential, that they are high achievers, but not in comparison to others. You don't need to be beating the others. You really need to be seeing, and this is what the teacher needs to do, how do they convey to these kids that they are really achieving their maximum independently of where that maximum puts them in terms of the overall school system. And then the conclusion that Helle also mentioned in terms of what the PISA studies have been telling us in 2000 is focusing on low achievers. Focusing on those kids that need the most support, focusing on those that have trouble understanding the lessons. What was the main conclusion of the PISA science results in 2015? Exactly that the teacher was translating his knowledge into something that would make the click to the student's head, no? And it requires very different framing because it's not the general question, it's just how this specific kid is going to understand what I'm trying to explain. And so it's a more personalized kind of intervention and getting away from only studying for the test and getting the best grades and being the best compared to the others. Is how do you ensure that kids feel that they're doing their best, achieving their best, independently of what the others do. And it's a very, very complex because you are really demanding, you're really putting a lot of pressure on teachers because teachers need to know their students better and need to have more resources on how to achieve this learning process, particularly with those students that are in difficult situations. But it also requires, for example, external support from the teacher that is dealing with the academic subjects. More and more you need psychologists in the school. More and more you need support teaching assistants for teachers that will help them address. Because even the fact of, and that was documented, vulnerable kids or kids that are low performers that feel that they can have access to somebody that will help them close the gap. Just by knowing that they have that option, it helps them gain confidence that they will be able to deliver. So it's a very important element to try to identify what are the specific needs of kids and provide the system around school to help this to happen. And as I said, it's a the overall system. It's not only the school, it's also the parents, as I said, and it's also the kind of support that they receive in the class. And listen what Korea is doing. They're very worried because it's not only about the pressure of the anxiety or this question of being the best. These kids, they have high levels of suicide. They have lots of bullying, very high levels of bullying, very difficult social relationship, peer relationships. And what they're doing is they are trying with this free semester to see how would it be. If we have focused too much on the cognitive, how would it be to provide kids with music, to provide kids with extracurricular, to provide kids with more exercise, to get rid of exams and see how we can manage different ways of learning. So this experimentation is also useful to try to diminish the pressure in the kids to be overachievers, but on the negative side. No, I mean France also. France is very famous for using negative pressure. And ranking kids and always signaling and humiliating kids that are not performing is just not delivering on average.
I want to add two things. First of all, about Korea. Save the Children, we work in Korea. We have a member organization in Korea, and I think it's the only country where we're really trying to create a cultural shift for children to play. So it's not only about having extracurricular activities or more sports. Children from their small need time to play. And what we're seeing in Korea are children, because the parents are so ambitious for their children, so they have a full day of activities where they have to learn. They come home from school at 3, then they do their piano lessons, then they do their English lessons, then they do, their tutor comes in to help them with their homework. This is how many Korean children live, and it makes them very unhappy. So I actually think the whole discussion whether a high-performing system stresses their children, I mean, the first and last question should always be, are these children happy at all? Are they capable of living a happy life? And I think that's one of the things we're campaigning for, because we are protecting children also from their parents and their society's ambition. So that is one of the issues we are talking about in Korea. But one thing I want to say in general is that what I'm always missing when I read PISA is and I think I had a clear understanding of that now since I've been with Save the Children, is that it doesn't show the differences within the country. Because what we're seeing in many of the OECD countries will probably be that you have children in one area that are performing very well, being very happy, but then you have other areas where that is not the case, where children are leaving school too early, where girls are becoming pregnant, where children are not actually doing the education system in a way that is satisfactory. And I think that would be very interesting to see that. And that is because we always have the lens that we want to reach the most deprived children in any country, the children who are left behind in any country, be it the UK, Denmark, wherever. And that's where you really start to see that children live very, very different lives within any OECD country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But we have the information, Helle.
Yeah, but that is not here.
In the databases you can get,
sure, I can.
And you're right, because it depends on the countries, the way they apply the PISA, whether they get the regional differences and the community differences. But
I think you see a very, very clear pattern of countries where they have really big areas where there are left behind children that are far from the average. And I think that is interesting, because we always talk about countries, and I do understand countries and governments. But what we have to see just in Europe, for example, is that we have big differences in how children live in terms of their poverty, their learning, their well-being, big differences within all the European countries.
Thank you. And
can I just make a comment, because we have beyond PISA, we are developing the Inclusive Growth Initiative exactly because of that, because you have the inequality of incomes that is leading to inequality of opportunities to access good school, good education, and then of course inequality of outcomes. And you're right, because we just have confirmed that if you are in the OECD, a boy or girl that live in a family whose parents have not reached secondary education, you have 15% chances to reaching higher high school level, compared to 65% of the better off. So this is the comprehensive agenda. The education is one part, but the reality is that we are just reproducing the disadvantages of the different communities, and this is expressed, as I said, in the rejection of the model that we have followed.
Thank you. And that's definitely an issue that we recognise here in the UK, where we have quite significant gaps in both attainment and indeed opportunity between areas like London and other parts of the country, particularly in the north and the coastal regions. So that's certainly an area that we identify with and has been a subject of much debate over recent months. Gentleman there, and then I'll come to you at the front, if that's okay.
Thanks. Chris Waterman. I run a loss-making project in Wales called Investors in Families, and I was delighted to read Chapter 9 in your report. I don't expect people to flick through their memory sticks. What I'm interested in, if we go back to the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which is now 95 years old, that was talking about the material and spiritual rights of the child. Spiritual is now less religious but more mental health. And what we have in England at the moment, apart from a little local difficulty with some of our neighbours, is an education system where we're introducing selection, which will mean that 75% of the population will fail the proposed national 11+. Do you think that will help well-being in England? And a question, can we come up with a strapline that the media will understand and the public will understand about the importance of mental health, or a little credit card that gets the message across? I mean, it's great that the Prince has come out in favour of therapy, but we can't expect people to read your telephone book. We need something crystal clear, sharp and precise about the importance of mental health and families. I know it's a big ask for PISA, because, you know, you go in for scullions of words, but just 3 sentences would help everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can say something about mental health. No, but this is something that we are very engaged in Save the Children. We just did, I think, the first of its kind mental health survey of Syrian children. And that is because we are very, very convinced that the wounds that are invisible will be as hard to mend as any of the other wounds for these children. The results, of course, are devastating when you ask Syrian children living not in Syria anymore. Some of them actually live in Aleppo still, but we ask them how they're feeling. And the problems that these children have, I mean, apart from the bedwetting and the dreams, and that they don't have the drawings that they make, the fact that they commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide, the factors of their lives are devastating. And I feel that if we don't do anything about this as an international community, we will actually create a complete lost generation for these children that have experienced this. And of course, we have only asked 500 of them, but it's enough to give us an idea that the mental health issues for refugee children or children fleeing war and conflict will actually impact not only them, but whole communities and perhaps ourselves as well in other forms in the future in a way that we have not foreseen yet. So if you have more than 60 million people on the move because they're fleeing war, conflict, drought, climate change, all these things, half of them are children, and many of them have mental health issues. We are creating an enormous issue for ourselves. So this is something that is extremely important. I also saw surveys of university students where their mental issues are changing. You talked about Gabriela. So I think it is timely and perhaps also too late that the world is waking up to mental health issues for children, young people. And I think particularly children who has been affected by war and conflict, the result of inaction could be devastating not only for them but for all of us.
Regarding your first question on tracking, PISA has always been very clear that it doesn't work. That the reality is that it's usually reproducing the original advantages that certain kids have, because of course it's just common sense to know that if you belong to a more wealthy family, you will have access to all the means, all the networks, all the encouragements, all the care that will of course put you in a much better position to be a high achiever, and therefore probably you will get higher chances to be accepted in these very demanding schools. So it's not the question of plain tracking, is how do you ensure that the low-income groups are well represented in those very selective schools and places, and it's not what we are seeing in the systems that use tracking, that there is not enough emphasis in ensuring that we do not just go for self-selection according to where the kids are and just take them like that, but how do you ensure that those that are leaving behind can also have that opportunity? That's a very important element. And also how to focus on the low achievers and on those that have problems, because it's just as simple as that. You have systems that focus on those that achieve, the high achievers. You support the high achievers. It's like, that's fine. They will always do well. Why don't you go to the low achievers and kids that are in vulnerable situations? So that's a very important part of the story. I have to say that we just with this telephone directory, as you call it, I hope that we will get the message through, in the sense that it's very important to focus on mental health. That the system produce pressures and produce influences that are affecting our kids. I'm very worried about girls. I think that the more we do in terms of trying to produce policies for gender equality in so many areas, we are just shooting ourselves in the foot if we continue reproducing the role models and the social media and the exposure of these girls to patterns that are just completely unhealthy. And I have to say that there is not a question of schools, it's a question of everybody. We have also documented that, and that's a point of this contribution that we do. We are just documenting, and we're happy that all of you go out and use it to push the message across, because the reality is that we have also documented that girls have less self-confidence. Why? Why should they have less self-confidence? Even we have a beautiful book. I didn't bring it, but we should have brought it, Alice, because it was the ABC of gender equality. That is also results from gender for PISA, dealing with gender and how girls fare. And the fact is that even for high achiever girls, the top achiever girls, you ask them, "Are you good at school?" And they say 30% yes, compared to 60% of boys. You go with and said, why don't they choose a STEM? We're always worried about STEM and of course all the IT and digital disciplines. They don't choose it. Why? Because teachers are not trained to be encouraging for girls to go for boys kind of disciplines. And they are not, teachers are not trained in these biases that we all have. Why don't we just go, for example, to eliminate gender stereotypes in textbooks? Always a beautiful dancer and a very strong worker, which is a male. And so these kind of things. And so these all impact the way you build your own self-confidence. And these have this possibility of leaving you with very, very important mental health problems that is now impacting the health services in these countries. So let's just go out and transmit this message as loud as we can.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more from the front here, Amy, if that's okay.
Thomas, I work for Teach First, so it's been encouraging to hear you make the link between teaching and support they need to deliver against this range of issues. My question is that one thing that strikes me, hearing all that you're saying, is the primacy of the assessment systems in governing what happens in the classrooms. So in environments where governments are cutting the funding to schools, how are you going to allow for the teachers and schools to alleviate those pressures unless you do something about the assessment practices, about the forms that assessment takes, about the values that correspond with that kind of assessment? How people perceive themselves and their futures in relation to what is often a narrow band of competencies.
Well, this is a very old debate in terms of systems that are completely biased towards exams and assessing performance through exams. I don't find any good replacement for that. But you're right that you need to keep a balance in terms of how you assess performance for kids. But even if you are and to put, of course, exams as a mean to an end, because then sometimes become the end in itself. And so the rankings and the results but I have to say that there are even very interesting tricks on how you do exams and how you prepare kids for the exam. If kids feel, and this is also proven in this report, if kids feel that they are well accompanied to prepare the exams, they do better. So it's not a question of whether you have exams or not. It's a question of how you accompany kids and prepare them to confront with the assessments. And even very interesting tricks, because the question is how you, the whole message is how you build the self-confidence of kids to manage their own learning process. That's the whole message. How do you build it? And if you are going to do an exam that starts with an impossible question, the most difficult question you find, and then the kids get blocked because of the way you structure the exam, you lose that possibility. And so the trick to do exams and start with easy questions that build the self-confidence of kids managing the test, no? Because there's no terrible horror than when you get into an exam and you see the first question and you don't know the answer. But how do you prepare these kind of elements? But you are right. There are things that are not going to be measured by exams. How do you address bullying? How do you talk to kids to talk about bullying? How do you redress bullying? How do you get into the bullying kids to teach them to retrain them to? It's a whole set of issues that will help probably allow kids to be happier. But of course, you need to test them. You need to see how they fare and how they can advance in their progression in their own learning processes. But it's the how you do it, not the what or if you do it or not.
Okay, I think we've got one very, very quick question, if that's okay, before we break for coffee. I can see people getting a bit edgy.
Thanks. I don't want to hold anybody back from their coffee, but it's going to be a very short question, really, to everybody here, but to the great speakers. I'm Sue Baker. I run Time to Change, which is England's anti-stigma campaign about the stigma of mental health, and we've shifted about 4 million people's attitudes over the last 10 years. Children and young people's attitudes are the most open to change, and they're shifting more rapidly now in recent years, and the working age population has also significantly shifted. So we're working with over 500 employers, half of all secondary schools, half of all universities, to break the stigma of mental health problems, and we're working with the Royals as well, who are doing great work too. So there's lots of us working in the education sectors, in the employment sectors, and with the general population. As we know, 3 children in every classroom has a mental health problem, and all need support for mental health and well-being. Why aren't all schools and all universities signed up to breaking the stigma and promoting mental health and well-being? I know Young Minds has a big campaign at the moment to get a petition to get mental health and well-being on the curriculum. We work with 20 other countries across the world with an anti-stigma alliance, and I'll wrap up now to say of all those countries, that's 20 of them, including the great campaign that we support in Denmark. It is very, very difficult to get mental health and well-being on the school curriculum, yet physical health has been on there since the day dot of education. What can we ask the OECD and others to do to help us get mental health and well-being on the school curriculum across the globe? I'm just asking what ideas there might be.
I think that one Mario is going to answer it. But the fact is that you touch upon the most important element, that is stigmatizing. It's not recognized as something we can deal with. It immediately puts the person that faces those problems in a situation of rejection, in a situation of stigma, in a situation of victimizing. So it's very difficult to recognize that it happens. For families, it's better to hide it because nobody wants to have a crazy child. So it's very important that we talk about it. It's very important that we say it. It happens. It's not that the kids have a problem. The society has a problem that needs to deal with it. We need to change all these biases, all these stereotyping, all these elements that are producing these unhealthy outcomes. But first and foremost, we need to see it as a problem that is not inherent in the person. It's something that is societal and that needs to be addressed by the whole society. And that's what we're doing today. We're calling a spade, and we're saying, let's just address these issues because they exist and they're creating a lot of struggle. So I commend your work, and I think that we should just keep on talking about it. I just want to close by saying that in the PISA exercise, and I still remember I oversee the work in education at the senior manager level in the OECD, but I also presented the PISA report in 2000 in Mexico because I was the head of the OECD center. And I have to say that the PISA test has also evolved a lot. You remember it was the skills to get a good job. And it was very cognitive, and we were following this trend in which IQ was praised all the time. The highest IQ, the more praise you receive and the better you are. Now we're moving into a more comprehensive, more human definition of what is required for people to be happy and to build healthier societies than we have managed. And the next edition of the PISA will deal with global competencies. And this is very important because we need to recognize our own biases. The global competencies is about understanding others, is about looking by the lens of others and the perspective of others, understanding other perspectives, the very same problems that we are confronting. It's about tolerance, it's about social-emotional, and it's about a more comprehensive human development. It's more complicated, and I know there are people that stick to their guns and say, cognitive, I don't care, let's teach math, let's teach. It's not divorce. It needs to get together. You learn better when you have these other skills that are well developed. So wait until the next edition of PISA that will deal with global competencies, and Mario is also leading that work. And it would really help us because the agenda that we are developing at the OECD for a new narrative of growth that is not only material well-being, that is not only GDP per capita, but that is multidimensional and that it provides with more healthy societies is being underpinned by this work in education that, as Helle said at the beginning, education is really the basis of all this progress.
And I think the conversation is changing. I think with the help of people like you and us, we've never asked 500 Syrian children how they are mentally affected by war. I don't think anyone has. But we have now. And that's because we want to put a light on exactly that problem. And you could say, well, obviously, they've been in a war, they've been in Aleppo, their schools and their hospitals have been bombed, they will be affected. But what we need to know is how does it affect them, and talk about it and be their voice. You're doing the same, and I think just now finishing this session, you are doing the same now. You are asking much broader questions than I've ever seen for children's well-being. And this is a data revolution that can change the conversation about children. Put the light on bullying. As soon as you put the light on bullying, and I saw that in the papers also before I came, and you showed us today, that means that the rest of us can now take over and ask the questions of governments, of schools, of teachers, of parents. Are you looking into that and solving that? One of the things that Save the Children do in many countries is to talk about bullying, mental well-being, and we can continue to do that. To broaden the conversation, have the data ready, which we have now, and that will only be improved over the years. This is going to change the conversation, and it will be very, very good for our children. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for that. And mental health and the profile that it has is definitely something we'll pick up in our panel discussion. But in the meantime, thank you both of you so much for your time and for joining us today. Thank you. So we'll take a quick coffee break now, and if we could aim to reconvene here in about 10 minutes, so by 20 past 11, that would give us plenty of time for our panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming back to the this morning's panel discussion. So there will be 4 panel members as soon as Mario, the OECD report's author, comes back from doing a rather glamorous press conference, I understand. But we'll kick off with our three panellists that we have with us now. So from left to right, we have Nick Heisman-Smith, who's the Chief Executive of Family Links. Then we have Sarah Brennan, the Chief Executive of Young Minds, and Professor Leon Feinstein, who's the Director of Evidence at the Office for the Children's Commissioner. Now, I'll open questions up to the floor in just a moment. But first, what I'd like to do is take a bit of chair's privilege and pick up on some of the debate and discussion we had this morning. One of the things that we're really interested in EPI, as you know, is the interface between education and young people's mental health, and how trends in young people's well-being and mental health are evolving and changing over time. We had some interesting findings this morning on the use of the internet, for example, and particularly high use amongst young people in the UK, high levels of anxiety amongst young people in the UK, and again, quite a significant gender gap between boys and girls. So my first question is what you think today's report tells us specifically about the effects of modern life, both at home, at school, and young people's well-being. So if we start with Leon.
Sure, thank you. That's a very big question. I really want to welcome the report, and I think the way in which Gabriela presented it as a challenge to an old-style narrow economics of human capital, which has driven our education system for a very long time, is very, very welcome. And we're all seeing the political consequences of an industrial strategy and education which has been driven by very narrow ideas about what humans are and how they develop, which has really come out of economics, which negates the complexity of the human being. I think there's a difficulty taking this report and trying to translate it to a study of the whole of mental health and well-being and the lives of children. I think this report is about the educational components of well-being. And I think that a name that's not been mentioned that's quite important in this discussion is Richard Layard, who has been arguing for a long time that we need to not just think about GDP as what we're trying to maximize when we think about policy, but we need to think about well-being. And I just really want to emphasize the fact that well-being is lots of very different things. And it means lots of different things to different people, and it can't be reduced to a single dimension. People will have heard me say this before, of non-cognitive skills, which is one dimension. We have a dimension of cognitive skills, we have another dimension of non-cognitive skills. That's just repeating the same error of industrializing notions of human behavior and then trying to change policy on the basis of still inadequate science, in my view. I think what's important about this report is it helps us understand the complexity of what we think about when we think about children's motivations in school. And so it's really important that we understand some of the big messages in terms of national average descriptive statistics, that the UK has an issue around bullying, the UK has an issue around anxiety, the UK has a gender difference in mental health, which every country seems to have, and those three are substantive descriptive questions. What I think really matters is that when we think about how to apply this to children's lives, we recognize the complexity of what mental health and well-being are. There are lots of very different issues within that set of things. So I won't say more than that, and I haven't really answered your question. But in terms of the context, I think it's really important that we don't make the mistake of repeating what we've done on cognitive skills with non-cognitive skills, thinking there's one way of measuring it and we've just got to maximize that thing.
Thank you. And Sarah, I'm particularly interested in your view on things like the impact of bullying and use of the internet and how we understand well-being.
I think, first of all, we, just in response around this research, I think it's very complementary to lots of the things that we're doing around developing better understanding about children's mental health and well-being, and the impact of life in terms of developing good emotional resilience and how we enable young people to have well-being when they're leaving school. I'm interested, I was saying in the break, that some of the research, in fact, by Professor Layard
has shown that well-being on leaving school is a much better indicator about long-term life outcomes for young people and adults than educational attainment. And I'm sad the research is not here, because I'd be very interested to know. That was going to be my question earlier. And as much as we are seeing the much increased rates of mental illness amongst young people, there is a debate out about whether actually it's increased numbers or what we're seeing is a result of a reduced amount of early intervention services, a reduced amount of help that's out there at the right time. And also, certainly, childhood has changed, partly to do with what's expected in school. When Young Minds asked a couple of years ago young people about what were their concerns, what were their top concerns about life, what were they worried about, school stress absolutely is one of the top 5. Fear of unemployment from young people as young as 11 was on their minds, was one of their top concerns, alongside bullying, no surprises there, and alongside all the sorts of things connected to the internet around pornography, access to pornography, the impact that had on young people's identity, what they thought they should be looking like, about self-image, around size, how pretty they are, how muscly they are as a young man. And I think we've been very slow as adults to catch up with that. There's lots of really good things, as we know, as well, around the internet, around finding help when there's nothing else out there. One of the things that I really would like us to focus attention on is exactly what this report has brought up around what are young people's lives like in school? What happens to them when they're in school? Because I agree about the narrow definition about getting attainment, and that's a very poor indicator about how they're going to do. And one of the things that we've done at Young Minds is, as was mentioned earlier, campaign around well-being in schools. But this has to be as important as attainment, because if well-being is so a critical factor in terms of positive life outcomes, and we know that mental illness is the biggest cause of loss of production in employment, and so is the biggest cost to employers as well. The only way we're going to shift that, so coming back to an economic argument, actually is to look at children and young people's well-being and mental health and how we help them build resilience. You can learn some of these skills around how to look after yourself, around how you look at the assets you have around you, how you use those positively. So I think for us, the challenge is, what is the role of teachers? It has to be more than rote learning and exam preparation. It has to be about how are these children doing, what's their life like in school. And that means you've actually got to look at teachers too, because if their well-being is so stressed that they can't actually think about, even in terms of this research, their teaching style, about what's going on in terms of the educational development of the children in front of them, actually we can't shift at all. So I must also say, as a plug here, please do check out the Young Minds website, sign up to the Wise Up campaign, and the letter to the Prime Minister saying we've got to shift this balance. It can't remain. It's not good for us as a healthy nation. It costs us both in terms of health, but it costs us in terms of the human cost, but also in terms of our economic costs, in terms of productivity.
Thank you, Sarah. And Nick, your reflections on modern life and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would echo many of the points that have been raised, particularly around the broadening of the narrative around what we see as the value and the purpose of education today. And I think a report of this depth and this quality making that point can only be good. And similarly to Gabriela, the extent to which children's voice really comes through in this report. One of the biggest challenges for me and for all of us here in the room, I think, is really to do with Leon's point about conceptual clarity. When we talk about well-being and mental health and resilience and grit and growth mindset, we can get quite caught up in sort of a maelstrom of terminology that to some extent is used interchangeably. And I think that's one of the key things that we could do out of this period of time is to get some real clarity around when do we use the term emotional health? When do we use the term mental health? When do we talk about resilience? Because they are all conceptually, I think, very, very different. And it speaks then to this point that Leon made about measurement, where actually if we're going to try and have a small handful of measures that are looking at these issues, we need to be very clear about what are these sort of the concepts that underpin them. I think when I looked at this report, for me and based on the work that we do at Family Links, the teachers with whom we work would say that there is a lot here that really backs up what they experience on a day-to-day basis. They are seeing the impact of the internet come through the door every morning when teachers are trying to support young people to figure out the relational struggles and the challenges from social media from the night before. We know that online bullying is something that is a huge challenge for school teachers to manage, given most of it happens outside of the school day. The stats today on girls and body image and girls and eating I found really distressing. And I think there's a lot that is being done. There are some great examples of school projects and curriculum resources where teachers have been able to engage with the politicization of the female body in media and in advertising in particular, and bring that to life for children in a way that's hugely empowering to girls. And I think the final point really is around teacher training. When we work with Teach First, when we work with university providers who train teachers, the content in most of those courses that looks at child well-being or looks at psychology or human development is so small at the moment. And I think we're sending armies of passionate teachers out into the classroom each year, really poorly equipped to understand some of those complexities about which we're speaking. So if there's a recommendation out of today that I'm really passionate we see through, it's around teacher training.
Okay. Leon, you look like you wanted to come back on that point. I just wanted to
bring out one other point which I think is really important from this work, and it came up a bit this morning, but is really the challenge for this country is about high-stakes testing in schools and high-stakes accountability, which this report is a very strong challenge too. And I say that recognising we're in a local government elections purdah, I think. It's a political issue, but this applies to all political parties over the last 30 years. We've had a model of education which has been about high-stakes testing, and in my view, a failure to understand the difference between the need to have accountability for our education system, that the Secretary of State for Education is accountable for the success of our education system, schools are accountable for their performance, teachers are accountable for their performance, but to deal with that, we've tested every child repeatedly and in high-stakes ways that actually turn them off learning. And it is interesting to hear the findings about 15-year-olds in education, but I think part of the problem for the British education system is the generations that have gone through the school system that are disengaged from education and who therefore the parents can't help their children through the education system. So we just repeat these cycles. And a narrow model of high-stakes testing which takes a proportion of children, says they are successes, says to the rest of the population, you're not good at education, you don't deserve the best education. These people are turned off education, you then see the result in the next generation. So it's a very poor model in an industrial strategy sense about how to support skills. I think this report is really, really clear on that, and I think that's a very important challenge to the discussion we're about to have about our education.
Yeah, I completely agree about the report today raising those kinds of questions about the balance between high-stake testing and anxiety and well-being. And I could probably spend the rest of the time asking you lots of questions about it, but we ought to bring in some of the audience members. So you could let me know if you have any questions, and then once you have the mic, tell me your name and where you're from. Are there any? Okay. Oh, we've got one there at the back, Sam, please. Otherwise, I can just question you.
Hello, I'm Michael Slavinsky. I'm from the Brilliant Club, which works to widen access to highly selective universities. I want to slightly provoke you with a question that asks you either to double down or to explore other ways or other levers in the system beyond teacher training or asking teachers to do more. I appreciate that teachers build relationships with students, and
the way they manage, and the evidence from the report suggests that the way they manage their class and their instruction can have a direct impact on how students feel about their learning and the stress levels they feel. But I wonder what other levers exist that can improve student well-being beyond saying teachers need to do stuff differently or teachers need to do stuff more.
Who would like to go first? Nick, you started talking about teacher training.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I absolutely take your point. We can't put all of the pressure on schools. Schools are being increasingly asked to take on most of the early intervention work that's going on in the country, mental health support in the absence of CAMS. So I'm very conscious of the issue of putting more and more on schools. I would challenge back and say this isn't something teachers really have a choice about in many ways. These are the issues that are confronting them on a daily basis in their classroom. So there's something about supporting them to do that work more effectively. And moving beyond this idea that it's sort of a zero-sum game in education, that if we're not teaching, if we want to teach about emotional health and well-being, and we can't therefore teach maths, I don't accept that as a seesaw. I think it's much more complex than that, and there are ways to do both. To answer your real question, I think what comes up in this report about the role of parents and how we can support families and parents to do much more around that in supporting children's well-being, I think is something that obviously as a parenting and family support charity, that's where we would ask for a lot more support and investment to make that happen, not just for parents who maybe have more complex needs and families with higher levels of need, but actually for all families and for all children to be able to have access to that support.
Sarah, I think just building on from what Nick said, we do see countries like Finland and Switzerland who perform well on the academic PISA exams, but yet still have high levels of life satisfaction, low levels of anxiety. What do you think it is that they're getting right, and what can we do in the UK?
Well, I was going to say, and I think it links in with this, that one actually equals the other. And what the research shows, and shows comprehensively, is that actually if you have good well-being, if you have higher satisfaction amongst students, actually that helps your attainment. So I think, as Nick said, this isn't either or. And I think what we're looking at is a fundamental shift in our definition of education and how we think about the job of schools. And so that we're not looking at a straightforward exams equal success, because clearly it doesn't. And we know that from the numbers of privileged young people who have got seriously high mental health problems, high levels of anxiety, eating disorders, and are needing to have long-term care. So looking at other countries, I think that there is clearly things that we can learn, and it makes me feel ignorant that I don't know well enough how there might be lessons that we can learn and translate to this country. Clearly, though, what we're looking at is schools as part of a local community and a culture within that school. We all know about the whole schools approach, and so we're not just talking about what goes on in the classroom, we're talking about what happens to children within that whole school, what their experience is, what happens at lunchtime, playtimes. And so I also think we have to look at what can we take away from what's being required of teachers at the moment, which actually isn't helping anyone, except maybe politicians to say we can tick that box. So it is about taking some of the unnecessary things away so we can actually balance up what happens in schools in a much more healthy way.
Leon, any further thoughts to add?
I've heard for a while that the Department for Education make the argument that because it incentivises cognitive success, school exam performance, and because well-being is positively associated with exam success, it is incentivising well-being. And I think we'll know we've succeeded on this debate when they're not trying to argue that anymore, because it's not true. There is a correlation, as this report draws out, on average between measures of well-being and school achievement. But there are a lot of off-diagonals. It's not hard to find people, there are probably some in this room, done very well in schools, don't have particularly good mental health, and vice versa. The correlation tells you about a general tendency. If you talk to teachers in the most deprived areas, they're doing a lot of work on mental health. They're doing work on well-being and mental health before they can get the kids to the point of learning where they're going to start to see progress in their exam performance, and that's just not incentivized. They don't get enough incentive for that sort of work. So I think there's a real challenge to think about. It's not that we should layer a whole extra set of responsibilities at schools. I think people are right. This is a wider social challenge. The issue for schools is, first, do no wrong. I think that's always, for me, actually the lesson of social policy that government should be asking. It's not how do we do things that are going to make things better by the brilliance of our policy. It's first, how do we stop doing the things that are doing the damage? And that's the issue about high-stakes testing. We know about performance anxiety. There's very good evidence from psychology about how putting high stakes, putting pressure on, undermines the confidence of certain people in their process of learning. So we know it does damage. So why are we doing it?
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes before we need to break up. Okay. Actually, I'll go to Loke first and then take you very quickly, if that's okay, afterwards. Let's see.
Okay, I was interested earlier on when we were looking at the figures about the fact about kind of links between high-performing schools and schools where there's high well-being and so on, and what that actually meant in terms of whether this, because we know that families, young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are probably likely to have lower well-being and also to perform less highly. So, what's your analysis of that, of those links, and whether there's causality there and whether not?
Yeah. Before you answer that, can we just take this question very quickly at the front here, Sam, if that's okay? Sorry, did you have this gentleman here?
My question relates directly to the points that you were making in particular, and the effect that the primary measurements related to exams have in understanding what happens in the education system. So you talked about alternative measures, indicators. So what do you think the best available indicators or measures are that relate to mental health, well-being in schools and in children is, and how can we use them?
Leon, do you want to come back on that question first and then address some of the points that Loic raised?
Thank you. Yeah, just quickly on the causality, great point. These are descriptive data. There's no piloting of impact. This data don't tell you anything about cause, and causes are complex, as I was trying to indicate before when we're thinking about human behaviour. But what's important is the focus on motivation, I think, and thinking of motivation as a complex phenomenon. That's something that this report really highlights. I've been struck recently hearing that there's a lot of debates about meritocracy and the idea that some kids are ambitious and some kids aren't, and it's basically genetic. What this report shines a light on is the complexity of motivation and the role that teachers and families and communities have in influencing motivation. I think that's a really important thing. But I don't think we know about the causal directions from this report. In terms of the measurement, I don't really have an answer. I would just say what I'm enjoying and what I'm seeing in the way this is going is schools are doing a lot more work, thinking about what they want to measure that is important to them in this territory. And it's not about creating a new set of national metrics by which teachers and schools should then be held accountable. It's a really difficult argument because without that, how do we make sure well-being is at the table? But we're not going to enhance well-being by creating a new set of high-performance metrics. So I think diversity of measurement, what the Education Endowment Foundation is doing around and others around creating tools for schools to measure things and learn about what's working, I think is really important.
Sarah, your thoughts?
Just picking up on the causal point, if we go back a long time when I was studying sociology and social policy at university, it was really clear then that our work profile, what employment was available, was different. And I wonder, and at that point, yes, there were lots of young people who weren't interested in school and their parents weren't interested in their children doing well at school because it seemed irrelevant. But there was employment for them without needing qualifications. Our work profile, our employment profile is changing rapidly. We're now looking at robots doing things in our homes. And the need for education for all of our workforce is much greater. So we have a pressure coming down from government because they know they need to have a much more highly skilled workforce. And yet we have still got a whole alienated group of children and families from education who still don't see education as being relevant for them. And I think one of the things we have never looked at and never addressed is how do we make this seem a relevant thing? And sadly, what they've done by increasing the pressure around exams is just alienate children and young people even further. And so we've done a very strange, contradictory activity. And yes, so I think the causality possibly is by chance rather than necessarily a proven link. But I think our policy has just, and our implementation of that has made it consistently worse and consistently more marked. Coming back to measures, I think one of the things that, again, we're calling for is looking at the role of Ofsted, because one of the issues for teachers and schools has been their experience of being measured, and coming back to pressure on teachers, the pressure that is placed on the school and on teachers individually as well. And as much as they have well-being as a section within what they should be looking at in schools, the reality is, and indeed the EPI report showed, it's a very small proportion of inspections even consider it. And when they do consider it, it's often in passing, and they have no particular shared notion about what they mean by looking at well-being. So as much as it is contentious, we have to develop a shared understanding or a shared definition of what is this thing that we're talking about. Coming back to Nick's point, I think it's absolutely right. But we do also need to educate Ofsted and have a government that says, yes, we want this measured, and to be an outstanding school, you have to be outstanding at well-being, because actually you can't have one without the other. And we've got a bit of a road to go for that, but it is one of the things that we are aiming to achieve.
Thank you. And Nick, I know you have to duck off in a couple of minutes, so.
Yeah, I would just really on the measurement point, from time to time we see those articles around the value potentially of having wellbeing league tables for schools. And I just really want to speak quite powerfully against any such notion, really for all the reasons we've outlined. But that said, when we have seen schools who are using data on children's well-being, on their social and emotional skills and their competencies in a formative way to help design curriculum, to help create opportunities within the learning environment to enable children to learn and practice those skills, that's when I think the role of data can really come into its own. So absolutely, the work of the EEF and the spectrum of measures, a few hundred of them, is that right, Matt? Yeah. We also have the Public Health England report with Anna Freud Centre last year that listed a great number of measures, many of which are publicly accessible to schools. The work of Right to Succeed in Blackpool, using the mental toughness, awful name, good measure, scale, has got some really fascinating data about how teachers can use that data to inform improved curriculum and improve teaching. And just really finally to really speak in support of Leon's point around motivation, I think there are some really good, there's some great psychology and some great measurements out there that look at the components of good motivation, and I think they actually speak to a lot of what's in this report. They talk about the importance of relatedness in schools being a key predictor of motivation, about a sense of competence, and also about a sense of autonomy in learning. And I think those principles are ones that come out in the report, maybe under a slightly different name, but actually speak to a lot of the challenges that we see in schools around engaging, particularly children from the most disadvantaged background, in changing that intergenerational cycle that we're describing.
Thank you very much to all our panel members. I think we'll have to wrap up now because we have just hit 12 o'clock. Thank you all for coming and for staying on for the panel discussion. Thank you again to our colleagues at the JP Morgan Foundation for hosting us in such a beautiful venue. Please do keep up with the work that the Education Policy Institute is doing. The PISA report was described earlier as a telephone book. We will be going through that telephone book over the course of the year and picking out some of the key implications and findings for the UK, much to colleagues at the DFE's frustration earlier. But we will be doing that, so please do keep in touch with the work that we're doing. And thank you again. I don't know if the OECD is still here or being caught up with press, but once again, we are incredibly pleased to have partnered with them again on this important report today. So thank you very much again, all of you.